Let's take a look at how we can create a storage account and then add storage in Microsoft Azure. So I'm going to click on storage accounts, and if you don't see this here, you can just type in storage accounts at the top where you see this search bar. So I'll click on storage accounts. So the first thing I need to do is to create the account. This doesn't create the storage, it just creates the account for the storage. So we'll go through the wizard. You have to already have your Azure subscription set up. If not, go ahead and do that first. Now we have the option for the resource group, just like when creating any other type of resource. I'm going to choose the same resource group that I created for my virtual machine. You could also create a new one by clicking on this link. Now I'm going to give this storage account a name, and I've called it Store 101010, just so I could use a name that has not been used before. Now I need to select the region, and by default, since I chose the initial resource group that I already used, it picked the same region, which I'm going to stick with. Now we need the storage type. There's a difference between Azure Blob Storage, or we have the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and Azure Files. So Azure Files is something we're going to be able to access using SMB or NFS for Linux, and that's not what we're going to want to do for this particular type of storage. I want it to be unstructured storage, so I'm going to choose the Azure Blob Storage. There's also options for tables as well as queues. I'm going to choose the standard performance because it's going to be less expensive, but you can choose what works best for you. Premium, of course, is going to be faster. Now we have the redundancy option. Let's take a look at that. We have local redundant storage. So that's going to give us copies within the local area that we currently reside. Then we have the geo-redundant. This is going to be spread out in separate regions. So if there's an earthquake in one region, our data is still safe in another region. This is going to be more expensive, so I'm going to choose the LRS. That will give me basically what I need just for this demonstration. So I'll click Next. Now we have options for requiring secure transfer for REST API operations. Many of these are not going to be important for the AZ-900, although they are important for when you create the storage in your organization for production. But I'm going to skip past a lot of this just because it's not going to be important in this particular case. There is one area that is going to be important, and that's the cross-tenant replication. So if we choose this option, it's going to allow us to replicate this data to a different account. So if you click on the eye, you can see that it's going to allow us to go to a different tenant altogether. So if you have multiple different tenants, you can replicate that data to those other tenants. In my case, I don't need to do that. Now I've got the access tier, hot, cool, and cold. So hot, of course, is going to be for data that's accessed frequently. And cool is going to be infrequently, so it's going to be less expensive. It's also good for backup scenarios. Cold is going to be when things are rarely accessed, and also choosing for backup scenarios as well. I'm going to choose cool in this case. I don't need the most expensive or the least expensive. Now we have networking. Do I want to be able to access this data from the public network? You can certainly enable this or disable this if you'd like. You can also create a network security perimeter where you can allow certain subnets to be able to access this only. In my case, I'm going to allow public access just for this demonstration. I can enable from all networks, or I can enable from specific virtual networks and IP addresses. I'll choose all networks for now. I can go ahead and change that later if I'd like. I can also create what's called a private endpoint to allow this private connection to this resource. So that allows connections to be created within the storage account or private link center. This part isn't going to be germane to the AZ-900, so we'll just continue moving on. However, this area is, and that's going to be routing preference. So Microsoft network routing is going to be less expensive. And that's because the request to access the storage is going to go from your computer to the internet, Then it's going to go to the Azure cloud. And if it's not in the Azure cloud you connect to, it's going to use Microsoft's routing within its own data centers to get to that resource. If you choose internet routing, then it's not going to go directly to Microsoft's data centers. It's going to go through various different internet routes until it finds the data center where the resource is stored and then access it. That is more expensive as well as slower and not recommended. I'll click Next. This area is important when it comes to the soft delete. If you enable soft delete, then it will allow you to come back in and undelete any files that you might have deleted up to a certain amount of time. In this case, you can see you can undelete them for up to 7 days. But if you do enable this, it makes it more difficult to delete it. Because if you decide to delete that resource storage later on, then you have to go and delete all the backups of this before you're able to delete the actual storage resource. So in my case, I don't need that, but that's something that you should be aware of. And the same can be said for containers as well as file shares. I'm going to skip past the rest of these as they're not important for the AZ-900 and click Next. Then we have the encryption type. This part is important because you have to decide between Microsoft managing the encryption keys or you managing the encryption keys. Now, if you do it, it does require some extra setup to do. Now, I have done this for customers before where it was required by the client or the vendor that the client was purchasing from, but they always give you specific directions on how to do this as far as the keys themselves and what menus to go through. So it's an extra several steps and not something I really recommend unless you have that type of a scenario. I'm only going to enable support for customer managed for the blobs and files only. And keep in mind that this cannot be changed afterwards. I'm going to click Next. Once again, we have tags. Here's where you decide who is going to get billed for this. It has nothing to do with the performance or the cost of the resource. It just allows you to go in and say, we are going to call this one a specific name, and we're going to bill it to a specific department or client, and then you're going to decide what resources you're going to bill for those. And I'll click Next. But keep in mind, you can create multiple tags for a single resource. And there's no error, so I'll go ahead and click Create. Here you can see the deployment is in progress, and it will let you know when it's done so we can go to that resource. It's complete. I'll click on Go to Resource, and here I can manage the resource. I can make changes to a lot of the different settings within the resource itself. The next step is going to be create my blob container, or in your case, if you're using Azure file shares or tables, something like that, you would use to create those types of containers. These are not the same as containers on a Windows server that holds an application. This is the container for the storage itself. So I'll click on Storage Browser on the left-hand side, and here's the different types that I can create, such as I can create a blob container. And I'll call this Blob Demo. Now you cannot use numbers in here. You cannot use uppercase characters. It's all got to be lowercase characters and something that has not been used. By default, you can see there's no anonymous access. You cannot change that. And we'll click Advanced. You can also add encryption to this if you'd like. In my case, this is just a demonstration, so I'll just go ahead and click Create. The encryption process is not part of the AZ-900 learning material, so we're not going to worry about that. Now I've got my blob demo, so I'll go ahead and click on that. So I need to add a directory, just like adding in a folder, for instance, on a Windows computer. And I'll call it blob demo directory and click OK. Now, if I were to install Storage Explorer on my computer, I could use it to upload and download storage files as I needed into Azure. So for example, I can go ahead and choose to upload a file from my computer. And I'll go ahead and browse to my C drive, and I'll find a file that I can go ahead and upload. I'll double click on Data, and there's a file called Test1. So now I'm going to drag Test1 right into my directory and click Upload. Now my directory contains some actual data, not just folders, not just structure, but actual data. If I click on this text one, I can go ahead and download this to my computer. So if I had files uploaded by someone else or myself at a previous time, I can go ahead and download those files if I'd like. So you can do this through your web browser logged into the Azure portal, or you can go ahead and install the storage browser, which is an application that runs on your computer, and do the same thing. Adding storage in Azure has a lot of different options, and you can go ahead and view all those options within the Azure portal.